The fly landed on the brim of her hat, a fat, black nuisance buzzing in the oppressive stillness of the Nevada afternoon. It crawled along the felt, a tiny speck of life in a tableau of death waiting to happen. The woman didn't move. Her name was Mei Ling, though the wanted posters just called her Ling, and she was asleep, or so it seemed, on a rough wooden bench outside the Red Dust Saloon. Her back was against the clapboard wall, her black hat tipped low over her eyes, and her hands rested loosely in the lap of her black duster. 3 men formed a half circle around her. They moved with the slow, deliberate confidence of predators that knew their prey was cornered. The one in the middle, a large man with a sun-scorched neck and a stained vest, was named Hobbs. He held his Colt Peacemaker with a casual steadiness, the barrel aimed squarely at Ling's heart. To his left was a younger man, twitchy and eager, whose name was Miller. His gun hand trembled slightly. The third, quiet and lean with eyes like chips of flint, was named Croft. He stood a little farther back, his pistol held low but ready. $500, sleeping on a bench, Hobbs rumbled, his voice a low growl. Easiest money we'll ever make. She don't look like much, Miller whispered, his eyes darting from the woman to the saloon doors and back again. The poster said she was dangerous. Poster said she killed 4 men up near the railhead, Croft said, his voice dry as the dust under their boots. They probably talked too much, too. Hobbs ignored him. He took a step closer, the wood of the boardwalk groaning under his weight. The fly on Ling's hat took flight. "Wake up, girl," Hobbs said, nudging the toe of her boot with his own. "Got a warrant for you. Dead or alive. Your choice." For a long moment there was no response. The only sound was the buzz of the fly and the faint tinkling of a piano from inside the saloon. The heat was a physical weight, pressing down on the dusty street, making the air shimmer above the hitching posts. Hobbs grinned, showing a row of yellowed teeth. He was beginning to enjoy this. He gestured with his gun barrel. "I said your choice." The change was so fast it was almost imperceptible. It wasn't a sudden jerk or a panicked scramble. One moment, her hands were in her lap. The next, her right hand held a Colt revolver, the metal dark and businesslike. Her hat was still tipped forward, her face still in shadow, but the gun was level, unwavering, and aimed directly at Hobbs's throat. Hobbs's grin vanished. His own gun was already pointed at her, but a shot to the heart wasn't as certain as a shot to the throat. He hesitated. It was the last mistake he ever made. The first shot was a deafening crack that sent birds scattering from the eaves of the general store. It didn't come from the gun aimed at Hobbs. Ling's left hand, hidden until that moment beneath her duster, had produced a second revolver. It fired from her hip, the bullet catching the twitchy young man Miller high in the chest. He gasped, a look of profound surprise on his face, and stumbled backward, his own gun discharging into the dirt. Before Miller's body hit the boardwalk, Ling was moving. She didn't stand up. She threw herself sideways, rolling off the bench as Hobbs' shot finally tore through the air where she had been a second before, splintering the wall of the saloon. Croft, the quiet one, fired as she rolled, his bullet kicking up a spray of dust inches from her head. Ling came up on one knee behind the horse trough, water splashing onto her black coat. She was no longer a sleeping woman. She was a whirlwind of controlled violence. Her right-hand gun, the one that had been aimed at Hobbs, now barked twice. The first bullet took Hobbs in the knee, shattering the bone. He screamed, a high, thin sound of agony, and crumpled. The second shot silenced him forever, hitting him squarely in the chest as he fell. Now it was just Croft. He was the most dangerous, the one who hadn't underestimated her. He'd already ducked behind a stack of barrels across the street, using the cover to reload. Ling stayed low, the scent of gunpowder sharp in her nostrils. The piano inside the saloon had stopped. The entire town of red dust seemed to be holding its breath. "You're fast, I'll give you that," Croft called out, his voice steady. "But you're out of position. I got you pinned." Ling didn't answer. She took a slow, deep breath, her eyes scanning the street. She saw the reflection of the sun on a window pane in the assayer's office, just behind the barrels. She saw the way the dust motes danced in the shafts of light. She saw Croft's shadow, a long, thin distortion against the wall. He was preparing to make a move. She raised her left-hand pistol and fired, not at the barrels, but at the large glass window of the general store, far to Croft's right. The shattering glass was an explosion of sound. As she expected, Croft's head jerked toward the noise for a fraction of a second. It was all the time she needed. She rose from behind the trough, both guns steady in her hands, and fired 3 times in a smooth, practiced rhythm. Croft was good. He had already turned back and was raising his pistol. But he wasn't as good as her. 2 of her bullets struck the barrels in front of him, sending splinters flying. The third found the gap between them, catching him in the shoulder. He cried out, spinning around from the impact, his gun clattering to the ground. He staggered, clutching his arm, his face a mask of pain and disbelief. Ling walked toward him, her boots making no sound in the thick dust. She stopped a few feet away, her revolvers held loosely at her sides, smoke still curling from the barrels. Croft stared at her, his flinty eyes wide with shock. "The poster," he gasped, blood staining his shirt. "It didn't do you justice." She said nothing. She simply watched him, her expression unreadable beneath the shadow of her hat. He slid down the wall, leaving a red smear, and collapsed into the dust. The silence that followed was absolute. 3 men, dead or dying, in the space of 30 seconds. The saloon doors flew open. Men spilled out, their faces a mixture of fear and awe. Windows and doors up and down the street opened cautiously. A face appeared in a second-story window, then another. No one spoke. They just stared at the woman in black, standing amidst the carnage she had created. Then a new figure appeared, walking deliberately from the small building at the end of the street that served as the marshal's office. He was young, younger than she'd expected a lawman to be, with a clean-shaven face and serious blue eyes. He wore a tin star pinned to his vest, and it looked too big for him. He held a shotgun, but he kept it pointed at the ground as he approached. He stopped about 20 feet from her, his gaze taking in the 3 bodies and then settling on her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice calm but tight, "I'm Marshal Vance. I'm going to have to ask you to put down your weapons." Ling looked at him. She saw the tension in his jaw, the way his knuckles were white where he gripped the shotgun. He was afraid, but he wasn't backing down. She considered her options. She could run. She could probably kill him before he raised the shotgun. But the whole town was watching, and she was tired of running. Slowly, deliberately, she uncocked her pistols. She opened the loading gates and let the spent cartridges and live rounds fall into the dust. Then she placed the empty revolvers gently on the ground in front of her. Marshal Arthur Vance let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He had seen the posters. He knew who she was, but the posters hadn't mentioned the look in her eyes. It wasn't the look of a killer. It was the look of someone who had seen too much. He did not yet know that the dead men at his feet were only the beginning of the trouble she had brought to his town. Arthur Vance locked the cell door, the sound of the bolt sliding home echoing in the small, quiet jailhouse. The woman, Ling, sat on the edge of the narrow cot, her hands resting on her knees. She had not spoken a word since he'd arrested her. She had simply followed him, her movements fluid and silent, while the townsfolk watched from a safe distance. Now, with the door between them, he felt a measure of control return. He leaned against the wall opposite her cell, folding his arms. The jail consisted of just 2 cells and his small office, all in one room. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and old paper. "You caused quite a stir," he said, breaking the silence. "Those men were bounty hunters. I found their papers." She looked up at him. In the dim light filtering through the single-barred window, he could see her face clearly for the first time. It was a strong face, with high cheekbones and intelligent dark eyes. There were lines of weariness around them that the posters didn't show. She looked nothing like the monster described in the Territorial Gazette. "They drew on me first," she said. Her voice was low and clear, with an accent he couldn't quite place. It was precise, educated. "3 of them," Arthur said, shaking his head. "And you were sitting on a bench, they said. Looked like you were asleep." "I rest when I can," she replied, a faint, humorless smile touching her lips for an instant. "It doesn't mean I am not awake." Arthur pushed off the wall and walked to his desk. He picked up the wanted poster that had arrived by telegraph wire just last week. $500 for a woman named Ling. Wanted for robbery and murder near the Central Pacific rail camps. Signed by a railroad magnate, a man named Sterling. "This says you killed 4 of Sterling's payroll guards and made off with a lockbox," he said, holding up the paper. "The poster lies," she said simply. "The poster has the weight of Mr. Alistair Sterling behind it. That's a lot of weight in this territory," Arthur countered. He sat down in his creaking chair. "And now I've got 3 dead men in my street and a woman in my cell that half the territory is looking for. You have to admit, it doesn't look good." She was silent for a moment, her gaze dropping to the floor. "Appearance is often a poor measure of the truth, Marshal." He had a feeling she was right. Something about the whole situation felt wrong. The bounty hunters had been too confident, too eager, and she was too calm. He had expected a cornered animal, but she was behaving like someone with a clear conscience, waiting patiently for the world to catch up. He spent the next hour going through the belongings of the dead men. Hobbs and Miller had the usual assortment, a few dollars, tobacco, a pocket knife. But in Croft's saddlebag, tucked inside a worn leather satchel, Arthur found something that didn't fit. It was a small leather-bound book, a diary or a journal. The entries were written in a neat, precise hand. He opened it to the last page. "Sterling is getting nervous," it read. "He says the woman, Ling, has the real ledger. He wants her silenced before she reaches the territorial capital. He doubled the bounty. Says he doesn't care how it's done, just wants the ledger back and her in the ground." Arthur read the passage twice. A ledger, not a lockbox full of cash. The poster mentioned robbery, but this journal entry spoke of evidence. It was a small difference, but it felt significant. He looked over at the woman in the cell. She was watching him, her expression unreadable. He stood up and walked back to her cell, holding the journal. "What ledger is this?" he asked quietly. Ling's eyes flickered to the book in his hand, and for the first time he saw a crack in her composure, a flicker of something that might have been fear, or maybe just surprise. "Where did you get that?" she asked. "Off the man you shot last, Croft," Arthur replied. "He was keeping a journal. Seems Mr. Sterling is more interested in a book than in his stolen money." She rose from the cot and came to the bars, her hands gripping the cold iron. They were fine, slender hands, not the calloused hands of a common outlaw. "Sterling is a thief, Marshal, and I have the proof." Before he could ask another question, the sound of a horse galloping into town at full speed drew his attention. It was a sound of urgency, of news traveling fast. He went to the door and looked out. A rider was dismounting in a cloud of dust in front of the telegraph office. A few minutes later, the telegraph operator, a young man named Peterson, came running toward the jail, a yellow slip of paper in his hand. "Marshal! Marshal Vance!" Peterson shouted out of breath. "A wire just came through, from Sterling's office in Reno." Arthur met him on the boardwalk. "What is it, Peterson?" "He's sending his own man, a special agent. Says he has a territorial warrant for the prisoner. He's coming to take custody of her." Peterson swallowed hard. "Marshal, the agent's name is Fletcher. They say he's Sterling's personal hangman." Arthur felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. Fletcher. He'd heard the name. A man who operated on the edge of the law, or, more often, entirely outside of it. A man who cleaned up Sterling's messes with ruthless efficiency. And he was coming here, to red dust, for her. He looked back into the jail. Ling was standing exactly where she had been, watching him through the bars. She had heard every word. The look on her face wasn't fear anymore. It was resignation, as if this was the moment she had been expecting all along. What had begun as a bloody shootout in his street was escalating into something far more dangerous. He was a small-town marshal, and he was standing squarely in the path of a very powerful, very ruthless man. That night, Arthur brought her a plate of beans and jerky from the hotel. He set it on the floor and slid it under the bars. She hadn't eaten all day. She looked at the plate, then back at him. "You should let him take me, Marshal," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "This is not your fight. A man is coming to my town with a piece of paper to take a prisoner out of my jail, likely to kill her on the road to Reno," Arthur said, pulling a stool over to face her cell. "That makes it my fight." He gestured to the plate. "Eat. You'll need your strength." She hesitated, then knelt and took the food. They sat in silence for a while, the only sounds the clinking of her fork against the tin plate and the chirping of crickets outside. "Tell me about the ledger," he said finally. She finished chewing a piece of jerky, her movements deliberate. "I was not a payroll guard. I was a translator, and I kept the books for the Chinese work crews on Section 9. He listened as she spoke. Her story unfolded not with anger or bitterness, but with a quiet, precise clarity. She had been hired by the Central Pacific Railroad because she could read and write English, as well as several Chinese dialects. She was responsible for recording the hours and calculating the pay for over 200 of her countrymen. At first, the numbers made sense, she explained, but then Sterling took over the regional contract. The men started working longer hours, but their pay packets grew lighter. They were charged exorbitant prices at the company store for rice and tools. Their debt grew. They were trapped. She had suspected something was wrong, so she began keeping a second ledger in private, a shadow book. In it, she recorded the real hours, the real supply costs, the real numbers. What she uncovered was a systematic fraud. Sterling was billing the railroad for a full wage, paying the workers less than half, and pocketing the difference. He was charging them for food they never received and tools they never used. He was creating a workforce of indentured servants. "The 4 men who died," Arthur prompted gently. "They were Sterling's enforcers," she said, her voice hardening. "They found my ledger. They came to my tent to take it, and to take me. They did not expect me to fight back." She had fled, taking the real ledger with her. It was the only proof of the crime, the only hope for the men she'd left behind. It was her testimony, written in ink. "Where is it now?" Arthur asked. She looked at him, a long, appraising gaze. He saw the calculation in her eyes, the weighing of risk against trust. He had done nothing to earn that trust except offer her a plate of beans and a moment of his time. But perhaps, after so long on the run, that was enough. She reached into the lining of her duster, which he had let her keep. Her fingers worked at a hidden seam, and she pulled out a thin, oilcloth-wrapped package. She pushed it through the bars. "He wants this more than he wants me," she said. Arthur took the package. It was heavier than it looked. He unwrapped it on his desk. Inside was a book, its cover worn, its pages filled with columns of numbers and characters he couldn't read, but the meaning was clear. It was a meticulous record of a massive theft. This was the truth, and it was more dangerous than any gun. The sound of hoofbeats woke him before dawn. Not one horse, but several. He stood up from his desk, where he had been poring over the ledger all night, trying to make sense of the crime it detailed. He looked at Ling. She was already on her feet, her face grim. They had arrived. A tall, thin man in a city suit and a bowler hat stepped onto the boardwalk. He was flanked by two hired guns, rough men with rifles. The man in the suit moved with an unnerving stillness, his eyes cold and gray. This had to be Fletcher. "Marshal Vance," Fletcher called out, his voice polite but edged with steel. He didn't wait for an invitation, but walked right into the office. His eyes swept the room, lingering on the open ledger on the desk, before settling on Ling in her cell. A thin smile touched his lips. "I see you've found our missing bookkeeper." He produced a document from his coat pocket. "Territorial warrant, signed by Judge Miller himself. I'm here to take custody of the prisoner and all evidence pertaining to her case." His eyes went back to the ledger. Arthur stepped between Fletcher and the desk. He was suddenly aware of how young he was, how outmatched he felt. Fletcher had the law, money, and guns on his side. Arthur had a 10-star and a gut feeling that he was on the right side of justice. "The prisoner stays here," Arthur said, his voice steadier than he felt. "She's under my protection until the circuit judge arrives next month." Fletcher's polite smile didn't waver. "Marshal, I think you misunderstand the situation. This is not a request." He nodded to his men, who raised their rifles. "This is a transfer of custody. You can give me the woman and the book, or my men and I can take 'em. Either way, I'll be leaving with 'em." The choice was laid bare. He could hand her over. He could save his own skin, keep his job, and let Sterling's machine roll on. No one would blame him. He would just be a small-town lawman following a warrant. Or he could stand his ground. He could make a choice that would likely cost him his life. He looked at Ling. She was watching him, her dark eyes showing no fear, only a quiet intensity. In her gaze, he saw the faces of 200 men being cheated out of their lives. He saw the truth of the ledger on his desk, and he knew he couldn't turn away. "I guess you'll have to take 'em," Arthur said quietly. He drew his service revolver, the click of the hammer cocking sounding impossibly loud in the small room. "But I'll make you work for it." Fletcher's smile finally faded. Annoyance, cold and sharp, replaced it. "A foolish choice, Marshal. A truly foolish choice." 4 months later, the dust and red dust had settled. The summer heat had given way to the crisp air of late autumn. The story of Marshal Vance's stand had become local legend. Fletcher and his men had not expected the town to stand with their marshal. When the shooting started, windows had opened and rifles had appeared. The miners, the shopkeepers, the blacksmith, men who had watched in silence as Ling was arrested, had chosen a side. Fletcher, wounded and outgunned, had been forced to retreat, leaving with nothing but a fresh warrant for his own arrest, telegraphed by a U.S. Marshal Arthur had contacted in a desperate plea for help. That federal marshal, a man named Dawson whom Arthur had known from his army days, had listened. He had read the frantic telegraph messages about Sterling in the ledger. He had come himself, not with 2 men, but with 20. Ling's ledger, translated and verified, had been a key that unlocked a vast conspiracy. Alastair Sterling was in a federal prison, his railroad empire crumbling under the weight of his own greed. The Chinese workers had received their back pay, a small fortune that had transformed the rail camps. Some had moved on, but many had stayed, using their earnings to open laundries, restaurants, and small shops in towns like Red Dust, changing the face of the territory for the better. Ling was a free woman. Her name had been cleared, and a formal apology had been issued by the territorial governor. She had been offered passage back east, or even to China, but she had stayed. She sat on the same bench outside the saloon where the bounty hunters had found her. It was late afternoon and the light was golden. She was still dressed in practical black, but the duster was gone, replaced by a simple riding jacket. She was cleaning one of her revolvers, her movements efficient and familiar. Arthur Vance walked toward her. He no longer wore the 10-star. He had resigned his post a week after Fletcher's retreat, saying he wasn't cut out for the political side of law enforcement. He had bought a small parcel of land just outside of town with his savings. He stopped in front of her. "Are you ever going to put those away?" he asked, nodding at the gun. She looked up, a real smile touching her lips this time. It changed her whole face. "Habits are hard to break," she said. "Besides, you never know when a man might need saving." He sat down beside her on the bench. For a while they just watched the street, the comfortable silence a testament to all they had been through together. The town was quieter now, but it was a healthier quiet. "I got the last of the fence posts in today," he said. "The place is starting to look like something." "It is good land," she agreed. "Strong land." He looked at her, at the way the setting sun caught the black shine of her hair. He remembered the first time he saw her, a figure of deadly stillness surrounded by violence. He had seen her as a problem, a danger to his town. But he had been wrong. She wasn't the storm. She was the calm at the center of it, a fixed point of truth in a world of lies. Justice, he had learned, wasn't always found in a warrant or a courtroom. Sometimes it was found in a book of numbers kept by a brave woman. And sometimes peace wasn't the absence of a fight, but the quiet that comes after you've fought for something that truly matters. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.